What would you do if the walls of your house began whispering secrets that were never yours to hear? Imagine a silence so heavy it can bend a man's spine, a silence soaked not in peace but in judgment. That is where we begin, in Brazil, 1837, where letters, brittle with age, speak of a plantation drenched in heat and blood. The letters were not supposed to survive. They were folded inside a pouch of cracked leather, tucked away like a wound someone tried to stitch shut, but left festering beneath the skin of history. When they were opened, the ink had bled across the paper like veins in a corpse, words faint, but still alive. Enough to unveil a story that should have died with its tellers, the tale of a master, his son, and the woman who was never meant to be remembered. The estate itself was a fortress of contradictions. Majestic verandas, tiled roofs catching the golden light of dawn, fields of coffee stretching endlessly toward the horizon. To the eye, it was order. To the soul, it was suffocation. For behind the perfect rows of coffee trees, there were quarters of clay and timber, where voices spoke in songs older than the land, where names were carried across oceans and chains, and where laughter resisted like a candle against the storm. The master ruled with a faith that was rigid, almost weaponized. A crucifix hung above his desk, its shadow cutting across every decision he made. He believed himself chosen by lineage and by God, a guardian of order, a sentinel of control. But even sentinels bleed, and even guardians rot from within. His son, the only heir, was raised in that shadow, groomed to inherit the kingdom his father had carved from blood. Yet he carried something dangerous: restlessness, a hunger for a freedom that could not be mapped on the plantation ledgers. The letters say the boy laughed rarely, but when he did, it was always when his feet carried him. Away from the main house, away from the gaze of the crucifix, toward the dirt paths worn by bare feet, toward the quarters, toward a forbidden presence not yet named. The writer, whoever they were, felt the fracture forming even then, a crack in the silence, a tension coiled like a snake. And though the words are stiff with age, they carry a weight that demands you listen, because once you hear them, you cannot unhear them. This story was never meant for daylight, yet here you are, listening. The letters shift tone here. At first they speak of order, of routines that made the estate appear unshakable. Harvests measured, prayers recited, punishments swift. But in the margins, a shadow begins to form, the shadow of a name. At first the writer resists, circling around her as though even to spell her out would draw her into danger. But inevitability always finds its way. Her name was Isabel. She was not the loudest voice in the quarters, nor the most visible. The letters describe her with the restraint of someone who fears admiration might curse her. Skin the color of polished mahogany, eyes deep and still, as though they carried whole oceans that no man on this estate had ever seen. A presence quiet but undeniable. The boy noticed her the way a flame notices air, not by choice, but by necessity. It began with stolen fragments of time. A word exchanged by the water basins, a glance across the rows of hanging laundry, a smile that lingered too long, long enough to become memory. The boy's steps began to wander at dusk, past the manicured edges of the master's gardens, down the rough clay paths where his father's gaze dared not follow. In the quarters, voices whispered warnings. Old women muttered of curses and ruin. Men cast wary glances, knowing the cost of desire where chains defined the law. Yet neither withdrew. Isabel carried herself with a dignity that unsettled those who believed submission was the only posture allowed to her. And the boy, he was intoxicated. For the first time in his life, his laughter was unshackled, his voice softened not by duty, but by wonder. They spoke of dreams impossible for their world, of seas she had never seen, of cities he imagined but had yet to reach, of a life carved beyond the reach of crucifix and ledger. The writer of the letters does not describe these meetings as mere accidents. They were rituals of defiance, growing, nung in boldness, each one a trespass against the master's order. And already, the estate itself seemed to notice. The air grew heavier around them, Footsteps appeared when none should, doors creaked open at the wrong times. It was as if the very soil remembered its blood and conspired to keep lovers apart. This was no longer a passing curiosity. It was a bond, dangerous, irreversible, written not in ink, but in fire. And though their lips had not yet spoken the word, the estate already knew. This was love, and love here was treason. The estate, once so silent, began to breathe differently. The letters describe it as if the house itself had grown ears, listening to the footsteps of its heir, measuring the absences at supper, counting the hours that vanished into the dusk. The master's jaw tightened when his son's name was spoken, and though no words of accusation passed his lips, suspicion was already sharpening in his eyes. The son was drifting further from the path carved for him, further from the crucifix above the desk, further from the marriage arrangements his father had whispered into existence with neighboring families. His absences became louder than his presence. At dawn, he stood dutifully at his father's side, surveying the rows of workers, but his gaze slipped, down the slope, toward the quarters, toward shadows that were not his to desire. And though the boy believed himself unseen, the estate had many eyes. Whispers travel faster than footsteps. Servants carried them in hushed tones. Overseers let them slip between clenched teeth. Isabel's name began to flutter in the darkness like a moth against glass. The writer notes that her very presence drew silence when she entered a room, not because she spoke too much, but because she carried the unspoken weight of everyone else's fear. The women urged her to withdraw, to let the boy return to his world of tiled floors and silver cutlery. But Isabel was not carved for retreat. She had endured too much, carried too much dignity in her silence to flee from the gaze of one restless heir. The master's faith turned into surveillance. His footsteps echoed at hours when others slept, as though the crucifix above his desk demanded penance through vigilance. A lantern flickered outside the quarters at midnight, not from the boy's hand, but from the father's, prowling the perimeter of his dominion, seeking to catch shadows in acts they dared not admire. Chum. The letters speak of a night when the master paused at the edge of the clay huts. He stood there for so long that even the dogs did not bark. The boy was absent from the house. Isabel was nowhere in sight. The night pressed down like a lid, and when he finally turned back toward the manor, the writer says the crucifix in his chamber seemed heavier, its wooden Christ carved not in mercy but in judgment. From that night on, the master's silence was no longer ignorance. It was knowledge waiting for proof. And proof, in houses such as these, always arrives, dragged from whispers into blood. The letters describe it not as a slow descent, but as a plunge. Once the line was crossed, there was no retreat. The boy and Isabel no longer lingered at the edge of glances and fleeting words. They sought each other with hunger, with urgency, as if every moment stolen was a life reclaimed. Their meetings became ritual, bound not by chance, but by choice. The writer captures them in fragments, the boy's hand brushing against hers while carrying water, the faint laughter muffled in the rustle of the cane fields, the shadows of two figures pressed together in the barn when storms shook the windows of the house above. There is a tenderness described in tones almost reluctant, as though to document it was to curse it. Yet even in those hushed lines, the truth blazes. Theirs was not a flirtation. It was rebellion. And rebellion here was sacrilege. For the master, lineage was sacred, order was sacred, the crucifix above his desk was sacred. But love, raw, disobedient love, was a profanation that no amount of prayer could sanctify. The boy knew this, yet each embrace dragged him further from his father's orbit. Isabel knew this, yet each whispered vow pulled her deeper into the storm. The estate began to change with them. The letters say the nights grew louder, dogs barking at unseen shapes, shutters slamming though no wind stirred, the fields alive with whispers like thousands of voices speaking in tongues. Workers spoke of shadows that followed them home, of cold hands pressing against their backs in the dark. Some said the soil remembered blood and that every step upon it was a trespass. Still, the lovers did not retreat. They carved a world in secret, a fragile sanctuary of touch and breath, a defiance against chains and crosses alike. Isabel's laughter returned in those stolen hours, a sound said to have unsettled even the old women, for it rang too free, too unbroken, and the boy, once pale with restraint, burned with a fire that the master's gaze could not smother. The writer leaves a line that feels like prophecy. They believed themselves hidden, but the house was listening, and the house does not forgive. From this point forward, the story stops being about secrecy. It becomes about survival. For the estate itself had turned against them, and the master's suspicion was sharpening into something far more dangerous than silence. The letters grow darker here, their ink pressed harder into the paper, as though the hand that wrote them trembled beneath the weight of what it witnessed. The master was no longer content to prowl in silence. His suspicion had hardened into conviction, and with conviction came wrath. He did not scream, at least not at first. His fury was quieter, colder. Orders began to shift. Overseers were told to watch more closely, to report every step, every absence. Workers were pulled aside, questioned in tones that felt more like threats than inquiries. The boy was summoned to his father's desk night after night, forced to kneel beneath the crucifix while scripture was read aloud as punishment disguised as prayer. Verses of obedience, of sin, of hellfire. Verses meant not to cleanse, but to break. The son endured it in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes lowered. But silence can be its own rebellion. The master saw it, the quiet refusal to confess, the lack of tears, the absence of fear, and it enraged him further. To the master, sin was not only betrayal of faith, but betrayal of bloodline. His heir was staining the very legacy he intended to preserve. The letters tell of a night when the master called the workers into the courtyard. Lanterns swung in the humid air, their light casting long skeletal shadows. He spoke not of harvest, nor of wages, but of damnation. His words were fire and brimstone, declaring that the estate had been touched by corruption, that demons walked among them disguised as flesh and desire. And though no name was spoken, every soul present knew who the unspoken target was. Eyes turned toward Isabel. Her stillness beneath the firelight became unbearable, a silence that screamed louder than any protest. From that night, punishments grew harsher. Whips cracked for the smallest of delays, rations tightened without reason, curfews imposed with merciless. As rigidity, it was not discipline, it was war. A war against shadows, against whispers, against a love the master could not extinguish. And the crucifix above his desk seemed to tilt darker, as though even the carved Christ looked away from the deeds it sanctioned. The writer leaves a chilling note. He believed himself the hand of God, but hands can strangle as easily as they bless. The storm was gathering, and storms, once unleashed, do not choose where they fall. The letters falter here, the handwriting jagged, ink blotted as though the writer's hand shook with every word. What they describe is not discipline, but spectacle, a theater of punishment meant to crush both flesh and spirit. The master had moved beyond suspicion into retribution, and in his retribution, faith became a blade. One night, Isabel was taken from the quarters. No trial, no accusation spoken aloud, just the scrape of boots against clay, the gleam of lanterns, the heavy silence of men carrying out their master's will. The workers did not move, for to intervene was death, yet their silence screamed louder than protest. The boy, locked within the manor by bolts he could not break, pounded his fists against the shutters until blood ran from his knuckles. The crucifix above the desk stared down at him, wooden and unmoved. The punishment was not execution. Execution would have been mercy. Instead, Isabel was shackled, her body dragged into the fields at dawn where all could see. Chains bit into her wrists and ankles as she was forced to kneel among the rows of coffee trees. There, the master declared her cursed, an instrument of temptation sent to unmake his house, a living sin to be displayed until repentance was torn from her or death claimed her slowly. But the soil of the plantation had memory. It had drunk too deeply of blood, sweat, and tears to remain silent. The letters tell of strange happenings in those days. Crops withered in patches as though scorched by invisible fire. Wells turned foul, their water thick and red-tinged. At night, voices rose from the fields, not in song but in wails, echoes with no mouths to speak them. Workers crossed themselves in terror, whispering that the land itself had awakened, that Isabel's suffering had broken something ancient buried in the soil. And yet, in her chains, she did not bow. The writer says she met the Master, his eyes once, only once, and in that gaze was not despair but defiance, quiet, unbroken, terrifying in its steadiness. It was a look that turned his faith into rage, his rage into fear. The boy wept in silence, his love shackled before him, while the house groaned with noises that no storm could explain. And the writer leaves a final line etched in trembling ink. When chains fall on the innocent, the earth itself begins to rattle. The rattling had begun. The letters change here. The sentences run wild, as if the writer could barely keep pace with what unfolded. The tale no longer reads like memory, but like confession, as though to write it down was the only way to stay sane. Something had shifted on the plantation, something no lash, no prayer, no crucifix could contain. The chains meant to break Isabel did not break her. Instead, they seemed to break the land itself. At night, the soil trembled with faint vibrations, rattling the tools left in the fields. Doors swung open without touch. Candles sputtered even in still air. And always, always, there was the sound, low at first, like a drum beneath the earth, then louder, pulsing, as though the plantation itself had grown a heartbeat. The workers whispered that the ancestors had awoken, that Isabel's suffering had pierced the veil between the living and the dead. They spoke of a curse older than the estate, older than the Master's God, a curse born from chains and ships and the endless hunger of the earth for justice. Some prayed for it to stop. Others prayed for it to finish what had begun. The boy was torn between terror and awe. He would sneak into the fields at night, kneeling by Isabel's side, his trembling hands trying to loosen her shackles. She would not let him. The letters claim she told him in a voice calm and certain, "These chains are not mine, they belong to him." And she turned her eyes toward the manor, toward the man who had placed them there. The Master, blind to his unraveling, doubled down on his fury. He ordered more prayers, longer sermons, punishments that grew crueler by the hour. He believed himself in battle with devils, never realizing the devil was not in Isabel, nor in the soil. It was in him. Yet the harder he fought, the more the estate seemed to rebel. His livestock died without wounds, his crops blackened at the edges, his servants flew, and in the night, whispering that the ground burned beneath their feet. The writer's hand admits something chilling. I could not tell where punishment ended and curse began. It was as though wrath had summoned wrath, and blood had called blood. By then, it was no longer a question of whether the plantation would fall. It was only a question of when, and how violently. Right. The last of the letters is smeared, the ink warped by moisture, whether from sweat, tears, or rain, no one can say. The handwriting collapses into jagged strokes, as if the writer's hand was racing against fire itself. For this is how the story ends, not with silence, but with a scream. It was a night of heat without wind, the air thick as if the sky itself had forgotten to breathe. Isabel still knelt in her chains, though her eyes were calm, distant, as if she was watching something the rest could not yet see. The boy was beside her, hands trembling against the iron, whispering promises he could never keep. And above them, in the manor, the Master prayed louder than ever, his voice cracking, his crucifix raised high as though it could command the heavens. Then it began. The ground shook, not a tremor, but a roar. Coffee trees bent and snapped as though gripped by invisible hands. Lanterns burst into flame, their light spilling across terrified faces. The workers fled, but some swore they heard voices in the quake, chants, hymns, the wails of thousands whose names had been buried beneath the soil. The chains on Isabel rattled, not with struggle, but with something far older, far stronger, until iron itself screamed like an animal. The boy tried to pull her free, but the shackles shattered before his hands could move. The links fell to the ground like broken teeth. Isabel stood, her silhouette lit by the fire spreading through the fields, and for the first time, the letters say. The master's voice fell silent. She looked at him, not with love, not with hatred, but with judgment. A gaze as steady as the earth itself. The manor was the first to fall. Its walls cracked, its roof collapsed, its crucifix splintered in two as flames devoured the timber. The master vanished in the inferno, swallowed by the very house he had built on blood. The boy's fate is less clear. The letters end before his path is revealed. Some claim he perished with his father. Others whisper he fled into the night, carrying Isabel's name on his lips until death claimed him elsewhere. What remains is legend. They say the land never healed. Crops will not take root there. Animals refuse to graze. Travelers who pass near the ruins speak of chains rattling in the dark, of laughter carried on winds with no source. And always, they say, a figure stands at the edge of the fields at dusk, mahogany skin, eyes like oceans, waiting. The estate burned. The master fell. But Isabel remained, and the earth has not forgotten.